So our next speaker is Nik Gowing. I met Nik the first time in March this year at the Liverpool station in London to ask him to be a speaker at this conference. Nik had just published the report, Thinking the Unthinkable, and that seemed to me a beautiful and highly relevant way to emphasize the key issues of this conference, for leaders to anticipate the effect of major disruptions on society. Fortunately, Nik immediately agreed. Since then, I have had many conversations with him, and I came to appreciate why Exeter University in 2012 and Bristol University in 2016 decided to award him an honorary degree or doctorate. That said, they said it was a recognition of his ongoing cutting-edge analysis and distinguished career in international journalism. I think it is his uncanny capability to get to the heart of the matter by asking very penetrating questions. So it is with great pleasure that I introduce to you our next speaker, Nik Gowing.
Thank you very much indeed, Jan, and you do great wine and cheese as well in the NEC, as you know, that some of you, I'm a visiting professor at NTU at the moment, and we're moving forward and developing a project along the lines of the kind of things that I'm going to share with you this afternoon. So I have to say I was very struck by Roland's selfie, that explosion of our planet. I'm wondering how you did that. It was quite something. You could never tell these days with post-truth reality what is true, what is real, and what has been generated on one of these machines, and it's quite extraordinary. I should tell you, first of all, that this is my first slide, red. This is a red alert. And I'm going to pull together much of what you've been hearing for the last 2 days. I have the disadvantage of not having been here for the last 2 days. I had to stay in London, and I arrived very late last night. And I've apologized to Jan that this was not me misleading him over a coffee at Liverpool Street Station back in March. There were various other things which kind of crowded it. But the great thing is that as I came in from the airport last night, Peter Ho had already sent me a copy of the text of his paper, and it was spot on, needless to say, coming from Peter Ho. And I have the advantage of having been briefed about the other 10 speakers, or the other 8 speakers before the 2 earlier today. So what I'm hoping to do is really, at this time of a conference, help bring together a number of issues which we can then pick up before we all depart later on. But Peter was talking about a society at risk, hunting black swans and taming black elephants, a cross between a black swan and an elephant in the room. Then I heard Roland talk about a black elephant, sitting on a black elephant is a black swan. I should tell you that I was sharing a platform recently with a senior figure from NATO who started talking about black jellyfish. But even NATO cannot explain what a black jellyfish is. So, and then Sean Cleary as well. And what I'm going to pick up is many of the things, and I've heard Sean talk about this before. In fact, we're very much on the same wavelength, talking about governance and the challenges of those in power and those serving them, which is critical, handling the enormity of what is happening. And a conference like this really needs to point towards positives, point to ways forward, even solutions, because in my work, what I've seen very strongly is people say, okay, there's a problem here with leadership, so what's the solution? Easy to say, but incredibly difficult to come up with very clear ideas, or even the first clues of ideas. So what I want to do is make a contribution to try to answer why those in charge either do not or like rabbits freezing in their headlights until they have to panic and they have to act. Until they have to panic and act. And that's critical to all I'm going to be saying. Let me just tell you I will explain why I here, a face many of you will have known from the BBC, am standing here. I'm going to come to that in a moment because I don't really do that kind of thing anymore. I am a visiting professor here and at King's College, mainly because of what I'm going to share with you over the next hour or so. So, this is the way to talk these days. And remember, it's now government, this adds to credibility, it's now government by tweet. It's a bad day for Boeing when the president-elect just gets out of bed and decides that he doesn't want Air Force One anymore, which Boeing are building for $4 billion, and says, cancel it. Is that the way that business is going to be run, that government is going to be run? Surely this is part of the challenge of the new unthinkable. And I have to keep saying that. I have to emphasize that point because, and you're not to laugh every time I do that, because it comes naturally to me, but that is really at the heart of many of the things I'm going to get over. I'm going to use another hand or something in a moment. But as I say, this is a red alert, and I don't want to be facetious, but this is indicative of something which is changing very fast. And what I'm going to generate with you is an awareness of the new realities for leadership, and it's tough and it's scary. And why do I know that? Because many of them have been saying this to me in a major report which Jan has referred to, called Thinking the Unthinkable, which is a dynamic, fast-moving and challenging program based, and it started over a flat white coffee in a pret-a-manger coffee shop a couple of years ago, based simply on the people at the top. They wanted to talk to me, chairman, chief executives, heads of government departments right around the world about how awful it is being a leader these days. Now, that comes from Chatham House, from the Royal Institute for International Affairs in London, because just before this thing called Brexit happened on the 23rd of June, they were already having their London conference, and they recognized what we'd achieved in our interim report, which came out in February, and I'll come back to that in a moment. They recognized what we'd achieved and recognized the challenge which we had identified of men in dark suits, there are also women in dark suits as well, with blindfolds on, hacking their way through undergrowth, desperately trying to find a way through these new realities. So it is the lost art of leadership. Now, to just underscore, hopefully, the validity of all I'm going to be saying, I want to tell you what we said and wrote at the end of May for this publication in the middle of June, before the 23rd of June, which was the day of the Brexit referendum in the UK, because I hope this underscores the value and the depth of all we have discovered and what I'm going to share with you. Quote, in the United Kingdom, a majority could vote in June to leave the European Union. In the United States, the presumptive Republican presidential candidate is Donald Trump. Britain out of the EU, Donald Trump. To express incredulity is not a political judgment. Until a few weeks ago, what many viewed as outlandish unthinkables were not even being considered or investigated as part of corporate or political risk assessments. Now they have to be. Why did I start down this track, which has now become something of a startup, thinking the unthinkable, and particularly how to prepare for it smartly? Well, it all began because of moments like this, not just Brexit and Trump coming down the track, but issues like migration in Europe, issues like Russia as well. This started back in February, March of 2014, when Russia seized Crimea. You may think that's a long way from Singapore, but it could happen in this region at any time from several nations. It's when a nation violates international order, violates international law, and seizes another part of a country. That is not something that we've seen for a long time. Then came what Peter Ho referred to yesterday about Ebola. Ebola suddenly came from nowhere, or did it? It started in Guinea, as he reminded you on Monday, and then it multiplied where 11,000 people were killed. Médecins Sans Frontières had warned the World Health Organization this is going to be a catastrophe in West Africa. And as Peter underlined, the WHO just sort of ignored it. and they've admitted they got it wrong. Unthinkable. Why didn't they think about it? Why didn't NATO think about Russia seizing Crimea in the Ukraine crisis? Why didn't the European Union work out at the Vilnius summit in November 2013, what about the possibility that Russia doesn't like what we're going to do and seizes Ukraine instead, or parts of Ukraine? Because they'd already had assurances from Putin that this was going to be fine. And it was not fine. And then came other issues like this thing called Islamic State, seizing Mosul in northern Iraq. And then we had the 60% reduction in oil prices suddenly announced by Saudi Arabia. Look at the devastating impact that's had on many oil-producing nations, Venezuela, Nigeria. It's decimated their foreign currency reserves, and Russia as well, which is why Putin has been so anxious about his own re-election, or at least maintaining the support of the middle class with whom he has a kind of tacit deal on nationalism and populism. So that 60% reduction in oil prices suddenly hit everyone, including the oil producers, including so many. It was great for some people, but it was devastating. And as you know, it's become devastating for Saudi Arabia. They've lost probably about $100 billion a year so far. And that's what the OPEC meeting of last week was about, to try and raise the prices again above $50 a barrel. All these things were building up, as well as what happened with Sony, with the seizure, with the cyber insecurity, probably done by the North Koreans. Why have leaders lost the plot on multiple issues? Thinking the unthinkable. So this became something which I, as someone who'd really just stepped aside from the BBC by choice, felt was something which was a new normal. Or was it a new normal? Well, I was reassured by this, by Michael Ignatieff, the person who jokes about himself saying becoming a failed contender to be Prime Minister of Canada because he was a lousy politician, but a great thinker, a superb thinker, a distinguished professor of practice at Harvard University. He's now running the University of Central Europe in Budapest. And he came to Chatham House and said in March of 2014, this is the sign of a new normal. We don't know what it is, but more importantly, it's the end of the old normal. Now, that's the framing, therefore, for all of you to decide about how you manage this. And Peter Ho talks about it as organizational hesitation until events reach crisis proportion. No one takes any action because they don't think unthinkables are going to happen. So what I want to do over the next 45 minutes or so is get to the heart of this kind of challenge. A challenge where the IMF has said recently that unleashing a global revolt against is creating negative economic and political forces. We had the Financial Times, when they were endorsing Hillary Clinton, before she didn't, of course, win, talking about the international order of the past 70 years is fraying, maybe even breaking down, maybe even breaking down. This is about changing the mindset and the assumptions, which is why this is all in red. The red alert, don't think the way it is the way it's going to be. And that's a massive challenge for those in positions of power and responsibility. It's even difficult for Jose Mourinho at Manchester United. Not only is he facing a big tax investigation, he's discovered that his players, his highly paid players, can't cope with the business of losing all the time. That's tough, but it shows the real mentality, and it's not unique to those in positions of power and responsibility. My only doubt was the way they, the highly paid, brilliant players, can cope with negative moments, because the negative moments, not winning in the way everyone expects, will always be arriving sooner or later. That from a football manager. But that's the kind of thing that our research, very candid one-to-one interviews, all off the record apart from one or two, all of them recorded in 2,500 pages of transcript now, have revealed this problem of handling negative moments when your assumption and the way you've made it through your promotions, whether in a company or in a government department, has been on the assumption that things are always somehow going to get a bit better, even if there are bumps and scrapes along the way. Things are now very different. And I think I can quote what I heard Sean Cleary say at a gathering of private investors in Chamonix back in September. The system will be fundamentally disrupted. We must prepare ourselves. What if everything we assume is not enough? It really is about changing your mentality. And it's not me who's saying that, it's the people at the top, candidly, but not in groups together at the moment. If you're skeptical, then Obama at the United Nations, back at the UN General Assembly back in September, is critical to understanding the kind of way you can frame things when you're about to leave office. And that's what we've discovered from a lot of people who've either been leaving office or have left it. They want to be candid about just how difficult this is now in a disrupted society with disruptive influences. It could be said now, really, that what happened at the end of 1989, 1991, with what happened in Russia, what happened in Eastern Europe, that created 25 years of stability. That's all at an end now, because those rules and regulations and laws are being broken. Those assumptions can no longer be assumed to be correct. Obama, governing is more difficult, tensions quicker to surface. The principles of open markets and accountable democracy can no longer be guaranteed. A new tension between democracy and the highest level instincts for control. And that's critical for leadership in this new unthinkable society. Explosions in social media, making it easier for people to express themselves. Difficult for us in power. Dissatisfaction among too many of our citizens because expectations rise faster than governments can deliver. I have to say, I warned about this in a big paper I did 9 years ago called Sky Full of Lies and Black Swans Again, the tyranny of information power in crises. And most who read it could not believe it would ever be like that, and they were therefore in denial and rejected it. Now we've seen where I was predicting things would get to, and you ain't seen anything yet, in many ways. The old assumptions are no longer valid. There is a new normal, but what is it? I want to get right to where I think we're at when it comes to the way things have to move forward. And I'm going to put up these two words. And this has now come to life, really, because of Brexit and because of Trump and because of what we've seen in Italy in the last 3 days and what we're likely to see. We didn't see it in Austria, interestingly. Maybe the Austrians had second thoughts. But we're likely to see again earlier in the new year with the Netherlands, with Poland, with Hungary, and other parts of the world as well. There could be this kind of pushback even in India. And I'm not coming here Western-centric or Europe-centric. I'm talking about the evidence there is, that the public is now saying, and I've heard this said here, that it wants a new sense of purpose for corporates and for government. There's got to be a better relationship. And I'm speaking in a nation state which in 2011 had a shock, where the PAP suddenly was rejected in many respects during the general election, and it was a shock because the political system didn't expect that to happen. But the PAP has adjusted. Others around the world have not thought it would happen to them. It is, and you know what is happening, and that's what I want to get to the heart of this morning, and also give you the evidence and the signals as to why this is so important. I think it's indicative of this that the second thing is values. Not value money, but values. That S is underlined, it's not a typing error, to simply say this is about something much more. When you start hearing those in the corporate sector, as they have in the last few weeks only, starting to talk about we're in danger now of creating angry consumers and angry citizens, that's not about the value of the quarterly reporting and the returns to shareholders. That's about something much more, because the public can rebound, it can reflex, it can react against companies it doesn't like for doing something somewhere or selling something somewhere, and social media means there can be a howl-round very quickly, which can have dramatic impact on the fortunes of a company. Values. Look at what's happened to Volkswagen during the emission crisis. It's going to cost them billions and billions of euros, because they thought they could get away with it. There are object lessons here about how companies and governments run themselves and the assumptions they make about their relationship with those they are serving or those who are buying what they produce. This is a very big change, purpose and values. When I was here for the Singapore summit as one of the lead moderators back in the middle of September on the F1 weekend, the title of it was Unsettled, Unpredictable, Is Mediocre Growth the Only Certainty? Is mediocre growth the only certainty? Explicit in that is the assumption that everything else is no longer certain. And when I hear DPM Tarman saying in a place like Singapore, of all places, talking about helplessness and despondency potentially, in this cautious, rarely overstated state, and the fact that he talks about plenty of pessimism, and ultimately there being the danger of what he calls a leadership funk, then things are changing very fast. And what I'm going to highlight to you is the inability of those at the top to really grip the enormity of change. It's a challenge to their credibility and their tenure. And so everything I'm going to share with you is about the human capacity to handle this. No more, just the human capacity to handle this in this new environment. Because, paraphrasing the words of several others, the way we've had a license to operate up to now, because the public largely accepted from a degree of ignorance and without question, and did not have social media as a digital conscience, those assumptions can't be taken for granted anymore. Indeed, where corporate executives or public servants and politicians still assume, that shows how irresponsibly out of touch those at the top have become. You may say this is a bit rich, particularly if you're a leader yourself. But it's about opening up and being aware that this vulnerability means you've got to actually readdress how you're running your country, your department, or your company. And many are still in denial. The first conclusion we've come to, and no one, I repeat, no one has pushed back, whether in a gathering like this on the record or gatherings like this off the record between 5 and 50, sometimes bigger, brainstorming among senior leaders. The conformity which has traditionally got you to the top is now a conformity which disqualifies you from understanding the enormity of the change to the environment in which you are working. It's a very tough conclusion, but these are tough times for reasons you've already heard about. A new volatile world of the last 2 years, as one senior banking executive said. For business leaders, quote, complacency is now the enemy, not laziness. Complacency. The embeddedness of systems in corporates has now become the enemy. It's those kind of phrases which indicate the direction of travel for these remarks. So, thinking the unthinkable and preparing for it smartly. That's underpinning the rest of my remarks for the next 30 minutes. That, so you know, is the publication. And that's important to put up, not for self-publicity or self-promotion, but really so you understand that this went through a peer review process, and it went through a process of deep questioning and deep challenging. This time last year, and there you can see at the bottom the website where you can download a PDF and plenty of other things as well. But a new imperative for leadership in the digital age. Let me tell you, when Chris Langdon and I, my co-author, were assembling this and working out how tough to be, this is about how frank we dared to consider being without really undermining the value of what we discovered. And there was extraordinary pushback this time last year. The organization which kindly supported us in our research, up in the top there, the Chartered Institute of Management Accountants, they couldn't believe what we'd revealed. They couldn't believe what we discovered. And I have to say, even though I'm on the record here, they were reluctant to publish it. They couldn't believe it. And it was a tense time. We had to go through a very complicated process of convincing them based on the data. And that was critical because the executive in charge of education inside SEMA then said, it's the data that matters. It's the data that drives the argument. And it's the data that creates the value of this. And as a result, this was published on the 23rd of February. So don't think that something like this gets out into the public space even with a degree of comfort and ease. It has to be fought over because one is facing that sort of instinct of conformity, which I've talked about. But it confirms the dark nature of what many at the top have said is facing them, and they don't like what they see. As one business leader, a business school executive said, many people at the top now are hanging on and then going to cash in their chips before it gets really difficult because they realize what is going on. One senior figure even said, I feel like an imposter. I know what the board want, I know what the shareholders want, but I know I can't deliver. That's the kind of conflict and tension inside now. People who are going to work knowing the difficulties of handling the enormity of what is happening. So that's the core argument about executive leadership. And it's not about a failure of leadership. It's about a failing of the current model of leadership, the current assumptions of leadership. And that really does underpin many of our findings. And I'm not going to give you everything, but I just want you to know that this is based on data, not a former journalist standing up here trying to justify a nice trip to Singapore. And that, again, is what Chatham House put up on their front cover, the lost art of leadership. And it is amazing, and I repeat what I've already just said, when one discusses this in small groups, chairmen sitting around a table at night, thinking they're going to have an easy time, after 2 or 3 hours, they're all accepting that this is a major problem, the lost art of leadership. Now, I've got to be careful here, but I don't think any of you probably feel as vulnerable as some very senior people I could say this to. It's a bit like talking to alcoholics. Alcoholics don't like revealing their problem. But and particularly when they get together, but suddenly when one of them says, I know what my problem is, what is remarkable in this process is they all open up and say, that's me. Now, I wouldn't go around saying executives and public servants are alcoholics, but it's about the business of how they want to share their pain and their feeling of vulnerability. And that is extraordinary. It's also very heartening because it means those at the top do feel that they have a future where they can somehow, if they can somehow adapt to these new realities. But they all feel currently with Russia, with ISIS, with oil prices, with migration, now with Brexit and Trump, they do feel often like those with blindfolds on trying to hack their way through in the ways that I'm describing here. So what are 3 of the main conclusions? Very simple. It's not about spending money. It's not about computer systems. It's not about putting in new systems which are going to cost a lot of money, software companies benefiting enormously. It's about 3 very simple human characteristics. It's about culture, mindset, and behavior. They are central, and it's the people at the top who recognize that, and that's important to underscore. So that's the first set of findings after the conformity one, which I've given you already. Secondly, notice we call this thinking unthinkable, the unthinkable, with all due respect to Herman Kahn and what he wrote about thinking the unthinkable with the nuclear threat back in the 60s. Thinking the unthinkable. Get rid of unthinkable. This is more accurate. It's about thinking the unpalatable. Because in almost every case, the evidence is there. And I'm picking up now on what Peter and Sean and others I'm sure have said, but particularly what I've read from Peter's remarks right at the beginning. Like with Ebola, they knew what was going to happen. Epidemiologically, they knew what was likely to happen in West Africa, but the WHO, for some reason, had blinders on and didn't want to admit it. Same with ISIS, the Islamic State. It was known about in the intelligence community, and ironically, General Mike Flynn, who's now become the National Security Advisor for Trump, who's not much liked in Washington by a lot of people in the intelligence community, I have to say. But I heard him at a conference say, and he said it in the New York Times virtually a year ago today, we warned about it, we warned about ISIS, we warned about Islamic State, but, quote, it didn't fit the narrative. In other words, the data and the information they had was unpalatable. Not today, leave it for a couple of days or a couple of months. And that's what we've seen time and time again. When you listen to General Breedlove, who is the NATO Supreme Allied Commander Europe, and his deputy, General Sir Richard Sheriff, they said they knew nothing, zero, as NATO, representing 28 nations, of the Russian intent to seize Crimea. For a military organization, that is scary. The evidence was there, though. In fact, Putin had warned he would do it, but somehow it got lost in the system. So, I'm thinking the unpalatable. What is the scale of the challenge? You may think that I'm going to an extreme here, and I've been told by Jan that there really has been I think he described it as a mood of pessimism certainly in many of the remarks. I said, no, I think we should talk about it as realism. You can't deny all of this stuff. The scale of the challenge, I think, is well expressed by Chris Donnelly, director of the Institute of Statecraft in London. Not because he's long been a great expert in understanding Russia, but because of the perceptive nature of his North Country British way of thinking about how seismic this issue is. And if you go onto our website, you'll see a much longer piece, which is in the World Today, written by him, saying this. The rate of change we're going through at the moment is comparable to what happens in wartime, yet we think we're at peace. The global pace of change is overcoming the capacity of national and international institutions. Critical words there. Wartime, yet we think we're at peace. The global pace of change is overcoming the capacity of national and international institutions. That can be governments or corporates, overcoming. In other words, it goes back to purpose and values. What is the purpose of a company and a government? What are the values they have to espouse on behalf of those who elect them and those they sell to? Because the survival of many of these institutions, including governments, is going to depend on how they handle this enormity, as we are seeing currently with this round of political pressures in Europe. You may think I'm going too far here, but I'm reflecting an enormous number of conversations. Picking up what Chris has said, this is now an existential threat to companies, it's an existential threat to governments, and the whole business of how governments work. Not that I heard Sean, but he was talking about governance, and I think I subscribe wholeheartedly to everything I'm pretty sure I know he said. These are existential challenges now in this new environment. As a result, leaders who've been making their way to the top in a period equivalent to peace now find themselves unprepared and ill-suited for the new pressures and demands of war, and they're struggling to cope. It's not a war of weapons. It really is a war of new realities, new political realities. Cyber threats could destabilize, as we heard this morning, can destabilize a nation or a region in a nanosecond. Just in time, everything you assume here in Singapore will be arriving in containers. It may not happen if that system breaks down. Indicative of this, the German government have just warned that in Germany, every citizen should have enough water and food for 10 days. Enough food and water for 10 days. That's not about a threat from nuclear weapons necessarily, or a threat of being attacked by Russia with weapons. It's about something far more insidious in this new environment. I think it's indicative of the kind of challenge that there is when you hear Lord Nik Macpherson. He was Sir Nik Macpherson, who was almost the equivalent of Peter Ho, when he was, for 11 years, the permanent Undersecretary at the Treasury until April of this year. He dared to reveal, and he was head of the Finance Ministry for 11 years, including in 2008. As he left, on the 14th of April, you can find the cutting, front page of the Financial Times, he dared to reveal, quote, the monumental collective intellectual error by him and colleagues in the UK and US before the 2008 financial crisis. They failed to see the crisis coming. They failed to see the build-up of risk. As the chief economist to the Bank of England says, this is disaster in myopia, and it's getting worse in many ways. And this continues into 2016 and will continue into 2017. And there are those of you who are experts on artificial intelligence and the Internet of Things and big data and so on. In so many ways, you ain't seen anything yet. The current edition of Newsweek is great on the power of robots to replace jobs. We ain't seen anything yet, and the anything yet is Trump's promise, apparently, to provide jobs to people who've lost their jobs because they don't have the skills and their old-fashioned industries, thinking that suddenly they're going to be replaced. But if you don't have skills, those jobs won't be there. And it's the same with Brexit as well. Those in Britain who feel they've been left behind by globalization, those jobs aren't suddenly going to appear because of leaving the European Union. It's a fundamental misapprehension of the way the world is changing, the unthinkable and the unpalatable. And for the government ministers, the civil servants, and the corporate leaders, that is something that's going to have to be managed. It ain't going to go away, and it isn't going to happen in 20 years. It's going to happen in 20 months or 20 weeks. And that requires a level of adaptability, the kind of things that I've heard from Aaron Menyem here with his 5 principles. It's not about forecasting that this is going to happen. It's about being mentally prepared within your system to accept that this is likely to happen and have everything sensitized internally for that to happen. This is a dreadful word. Deresponsibilization. Why is this happening? We went to see Sir Simon Fraser, the permanent undersecretary at the British Foreign Office, before he decided to resign and not retire but move on to other things. He said, there are so many things I can't do inside the Foreign Office now because people are offloading responsibility all the time. You see that in corporates as well. People worried about keeping their jobs. But that's one of the reasons why stuff doesn't get to the top, why those at the top who need to know what is being thought about, what is being analyzed, don't get to hear about it, because everyone at lower levels is kind of palming it off, saying it's not my responsibility, shifting it to somebody else. And so Simon was one of the people who really motivated me to go down this track of investigation, because I met him, and he's a tough public servant. I've known him for many years. He's not a friend of mine, but I've known him as a very tough public servant. You don't get to the top of a ministry without being tough. And 2 years ago, in 2014, I was at a conference in King's College in Cambridge, and it was just after Russia had invaded Crimea and seized it. And he came in, he arrived late, he sat at the corner of the table, coincidentally, alongside me, and I said, Simon, how things are going? And these aren't his exact words, I didn't write them down, that would have been indiscreet. He said words to the effect of, it's hell. Every half hour there's a new crisis. Barely have time to write down an email or a minute of what has taken place. It's coming at us every day, day after day, and we are overwhelmed. And that gave me an indication of just how profound and deep the unthinkable challenges were to those in government. So he came up with this terrible word, deresponsibilization. I don't think you'll find it even on Google. But it encapsulates for you the word which is needed to begin to understand what is happening inside, what has been happening inside companies, what is happening inside public service, and why so many of these issues are not apparently being addressed in a timely way which is appropriate to the scale of reaction and response that is necessary. And that's because stuff simply isn't getting up through the system. And one of the phrases we use extensively is, it's because of a frozen middle. The middle of organizations has become frozen for various reasons, which I'm going to come on to. But remember that word, because it's crucial, if it is a word, it's crucial to appreciating the scale of what is happening. You've got the new normal out there, but within systems of government and governance, you've got a sense of deresponsibilization. The two are moving in different directions when those inside should be moving more actively towards addressing the scale, providing the insight. Particularly this is causing an immense problem for the next generation, the millennials. And that's why it's existential, particularly for governments and corporates. because a lot of the next generation going into companies and public service don't like what they're seeing, don't like the way they're being treated, and they're getting out. And that's why it's potentially existential, because the next cohorts who naturally would be assumed to be coming through the universities and going into fast-track jobs are backing out, moving away. We've met many of them, and they're disillusioned because of this. What are the 9 points? You'll find them detailed in our paper, but I'm going to just lay them out to you here, and do take a picture if you want to. There are 9 bullet points. Overwhelmed by multiple intense pressures. Institutional conformity. Willful blindness, that sense internally, no, we don't want to go there because it doesn't really suit our politicians and it doesn't suit our shareholders, so let's hope it'll go away. Groupthink. As a result, people bunker down and they tell their colleagues over a water cooler or in a meeting what they think they want to hear, as opposed to what they feel should be said. There's no point being an expert on Russia of any age if actually at the top no one believes you when you say this is like the 1950s and 1960s. Think of the way Stalin used to act. And by and large, there's risk aversion. No, we can't act against Russia. No, we can't act against Islamic State. What do you mean Saudi Arabia is about to reduce oil prices by 60%? It needs the cash to keep functioning its lavish economy. It's about thinking the alternatives. This is a very critical point. Fear of making career-limiting moves. It's a very personal thing, but when people talk about it, they say, I don't want to stick my neck out. I've got a good job, I've got a pension, I've got a family, I've got to look after I've got to pay for my mortgage and so on. I don't want to screw up my chances, particularly if the economy is unreliable now. One Director General of one department said, if we don't tell the political leader exactly what he or she wants to hear, I get my legs chopped off. I said, what? You get your legs chopped off? And he said, yes, I get my legs chopped off. And I said, can I just check that? Yes, I get my legs chopped off. So it's that serious and that profound and that worrying. And there have been many cases which have come to our notice since we started down this track of the brightest people getting to the top and some of them leaving with PTSD because they don't feel that in any way there is a sense of being listened to internally unless you obey and listen very precisely to what is expected, you will say, rather than what you need to say. Reactionary mindsets, cognitive overload and dissonance, but above all, that sense of denial. A frozen middle that lacks muscle, that's the reason. Some of you, if you're a behavioral scientist or if you're someone who's been doing a lot of work of leadership, you can say, we've seen that for the last 20 or 30 years. But I'd put to you that up to now, the systems have got away with it, even though these have been weaknesses and vulnerabilities in the system, because by and large, everything was moving in the right direction. There was a relative stability in the world. The economy was in good shape. Now, if you listen to Manchester United and Jose Mourinho, and if you listen to some of the other examples I've given you from Obama and so on, this is now a very different world. In a wartime, that is not helpful. Neither is de-responsibilization. So what? And that's where we want to move on to in this conference. What can we do next? And are there solutions? Well, first of all, so far our work has not really produced any solutions. It's easy to say there's a problem, so there must be a solution. We've entered new territory here where the relationship between power and those who are being represented is now becoming very different for reasons that all of you know. And that requires radical thinking, especially from the next generation. How are they going to be embraced into it? You may say, well, a lot of them are callow and they're still getting their feet in terms of the way the world's going to be. But I was in Marrakesh 2 weeks ago at the COP22, and what came through loud and clear, forget about Trump calling climate change a hoax at the age of 70. This is about that generation saying, think of us And we want a voice now, and we're seeing that time and time again. And that means under purpose and values, the next generation, the millennials, having that voice as well. And that underpins one or two of the things that I'm going to share with you. What next? It's about changing attitudes, culture, mindset, behavior, doing it not in 20 years or 20 weeks, but maybe 20 days. It's got to be tackled very quickly. What are the kind of things which would be helpful in this? New courage. By their own admission, many at the top say, well, I got here because I was a bastard. I fought my way up through the system, and that's the way I'm going to be. I sit at the top, I issue directions. That ultimately is not helpful if you want to be inclusive and hear other ideas from people further down the track. And there's been a lot of nodding in seminars when I've had very senior people attending, saying yes to courage and yes to a degree more humility. It's about creating a safe space as well, where you can confront risk aversion, you can confront denial, you can confront the risk of the career-limiting move. It doesn't affect your career in negative ways, even if you come up with an idea which may not prove to be correct. It's about having as much in the mix as possible. Only yesterday, was it yesterday? 2 days ago in London, I was talking to two people inside government who said, my job is to come up with ideas, but I don't think any of them get anywhere because they get stuck somewhere. So, there's also the language. Those are wacky ideas. Why not dismiss it as, why not call it wise? It can be very, very demeaning, and I've heard chief executives use that. No, we don't want that kind of idea, it's wacky. It may be actually very insightful. Notice I did say earlier, none of this costs money. Oh, that's a bonkers idea. What about being bold? Similarly, we don't want mavericks around. We want everyone to conform. I was involved with one large corporate, a multinational, where the chief executive said, we've spent the last decades crushing mavericks. How do we now create them? I want to shake the tree, he said. I said, if you shake the tree, there'll be no fruit on it. So there are these conflicts right at the top. It can be macho to say, I want to shake the tree. But you've got to think, where's the talent? Do you then bring in a whole raft of new people who haven't the first clue about the company, where you've got to create a culture as people grow into the job? No, mavericks are surely also visionaries. Where do they find a place? How do they find a place in this new environment? And there are other concepts which are coming to light. One government said, we're now creating a DARE unit. And it builds on what Peter Ho was saying, and I'm picking up from his remarks, I assume you read them 2 days ago. No argument for establishing bloated and sluggish bureaucracies. What's important is to have a small but dedicated group of people to think about the future, who will identify contingencies to be planned for and seek out emerging risks over the horizon to be managed. The skill sets needed are different from those required to deal with short-term volatility. Spot on. That's what a DARE unit is about. It's about those who are wacky and maverick being used to positive effect and for their careers to be enhanced. The Foresight department as well, that idea of thinking over the horizon, even if none of it comes to pass. Someone I was speaking to yesterday in a government department said, we do a lot of red teaming. The trouble is, none of it's very practical. And it's only dismissed internally as, well, it's a red team idea, as opposed to, that's what we need to be thinking about. So these, again, are the 9 points of challenge for you, which maybe we can discuss. And out of that come other issues. Reverse mentoring. The fact is, there are people lower down in that frozen middle who've got voices and thoughts and reflections, and too often they're oppressed. And I've witnessed this in gatherings not dissimilar to this. One inside a major corporate, we gathered, quite correctly in my view, in a dressed-down canteen and had a very, very revealing 1-hour brainstorming about what they really thought about their company. And I think the chief executive his eyes were opened. And this terrible word from the head of a large multinational bank saying what we're trying to do is develop the next generation because we realize that they have many more ideas and far sharper perceptions because they haven't been blinded and conditioned by being too long inside. The battle of conformity. But I think it's worth underscoring. There's a great book for those of you who might want to read it on red teaming by Mike Azenko at the US Council on Foreign Relations. He talks about how those at the top, once they start talking about red teaming, reverse mentoring, end of mavericks, and so on, the trouble is they're convincing themselves they're changing. And he says you can't grade your own homework. An astonishing number of senior leaders are systematically incapable of identifying their organization's most glaring and dangerous shortcomings. It's not a function of stupidity, but rather stems from routine pressures that constrain everybody's thinking and behavior. Mirror imaging, anchoring and confirmation bias. They're terrible judges of their own performance. And employees become captured by the institutional culture, especially in businesses that require deep immersion in narrow fields of technical or classified knowledge. So these are the kind of things I really wanted to get over to you, and I've got a couple more remarks to make before we join in discussion about the lost art of leadership, and how to think the unthinkable and certainly do it smartly. And you may have great ideas. If I go away from this with one new idea, that would be superb because of the work that I'm doing at NTU with King's College in London and also developing other ideas as well. But the other thing I really want to just highlight for you is work that I've been doing in parallel to this. Sky Full of Lies and Black Swans, which I talked about. Black Swans again. Okay. Black swans is now sort of fashionable to talk about. And of course, if you go to Australia and New Zealand, you really do see black swans. But I haven't yet seen a black swan sitting on an elephant in Australia or New Zealand. So what I'm talking about here is the new public information space. You may say, of course, we understand all of this. But I would say there's denial and risk aversion on this as well. I don't talk about it as the media in this new atmosphere of disruption. And I don't talk about it as media for the following reason. The media, if you talk about the media, you probably think of the Straits Times or Asia News Channel or whatever, the traditional media. I would say that that has been expanded enormously and turned on its head. Yet those in positions of power in government and also in positions of power in corporates still believe they're dealing with a newspaper and an evening news show and maybe a 24-hour news channel, the kind of things that I was involved in for many, many years. That has all changed. You've got to think far more broadly. And we are now in the space of post-truth politics, and as you'll have seen with what's been going on with the Trump election, fake news. So that's why I talk about the public information space now, the public information space. In other words, everything that people are carrying around on this in their pockets. I warned about this years ago. People never believed it would happen, where those at the top are losing power. They're losing power because people, if they don't see it on here, if they don't see it and hear it from the boss at the top or the government minister, they believe more readily what they can get there in a nanosecond. And that's a big, big tension. And as you know, what we've seen in recent weeks, literally only, is the capacity of those who've got a message to use that in a brutal fashion to get false information out there. That can generate public perceptions which have no relevance to reality, apart from this new public information space and the way it's changing. So it is the power now of the mobile phone. It's also the power of cameras now to get anywhere. Look at what you can do now with something which you can buy for $100 in an electronics store. This happens to come from the Italian fire service. But this was the big earthquake, one of the two big earthquakes in Italy. And I only use that because what you saw at the beginning is the camera down below, craning up. That's the kind of thing which you could never, ever have done in an emergency. Now, for about $100 with an HD camera and someone operating it from the ground, you can show exactly what is happening anywhere. That's hell if you've got an industrial disaster or a civil disaster or a security disaster or a disaster like this. What it means is that nothing, I repeat, nothing is secret. That means the police, the military, every government official, every corporate official has to act in a perfect way, because otherwise the likelihood is it'll be seen. The implications of this is that nothing can ever be secure. And we've seen that in China. You remember the massive Tianjin explosion 18 months ago, when the explosion happened in Tianjin, chemicals which were stored illegally exploded, and China State Television in Tianjin was showing dramas and comedy that evening when hundreds of people, well, scores of people were being killed in the most massive explosion you could ever imagine. And that was visible because someone used a drone to go up and show the enormity of what was taking place. Not only that, it's the portability now of what is happening. The fact is, anyone can do anything, as maybe many of you do for your family, at any point. You don't need tens of thousands of dollars worth of equipment. Now you can produce essentially high-quality video for anyone, anywhere, on any platform, anywhere in the world. You're dealing with YouTube, 400 hours of video posted every minute. And Facebook is now a news platform. And so is Yahoo. These are platforms who are aggregating information and material coming into them. The question is, do they edit? Do they curate? Do they filter? Do they broadcast fake news now? How do you handle that in this new environment? Basically, anything, anywhere, is likely to be filmed, including if your life is under threat.
What it was? A job, or was it a terrorist?
What you've got here is people who've just been bombed in Brussels. The first thing they do is they pick up their mobile phone to film the predicament they're going through. That's providing a degree of accessibility and transparency which we've never ever seen. And I speak as someone who's been through the film, the celluloid era, the first generation of video cameras, the second generation, the digitization of all this stuff. This is new. And if it's in a factory down the road, if it's a disillusioned employee, that immediately highlights something which most have assumed up to now would be kept under wraps. Similarly, the pressure that everyone is now under in this new environment, which I'm trying to get over. This is a graphic really to show that when Donald Trump starts tweeting, rather than sitting with his press officer on Air Force One, unless it's going to be Trump One in future, or the White House briefing room, and is putting out tweets, it's very different in a crisis, particularly if he's basing his judgment on what he reads on Twitter and what he reads on Facebook, as opposed to what is being briefed to him by the CIA or the Defense Intelligence Agency. This is the kind of scale of change that there is and how fast it is happening. If you imagine that in a crisis, the assumption I would put to you is that many people believe that, well, we can handle this, give us a few hours. And that's why I show a crisis lasting 24, 36 hours, and the information edge, the real pressure point, being 3, 4, 6 hours into a crisis. Those days, I certainly don't recognize anymore. Yet many are still calibrated to think of, we've got to phone the chief executive, we've got to find the chief operating officer, we've got to find the minister. That all takes time when the public is watching it on there. The public thinks if you are not entering that space, then you are hiding something, which comes down to credibility, public perception, crisis of confidence. So this is the way it's moving, has moved, and is moving relentlessly at the moment. The information age, far greater, far higher impact in a much shorter timeline. And relentlessly, that half-life is moving from 24 hours to what I would say is a maximum, probably, of 24 minutes. That's the reaction time you've got to retain confidence, to retain an image of credibility in this new public information space in a disrupted society. And that's where the tension is, up in the top left-hand corner. Greatest impact of these pictures, greatest impact of this information, and of fake news as well now, in the shortest possible time, which is why I say you've probably got 24 minutes. When Donald Trump tweets here, he better bloody well be right, excuse my French, because if he actually then tweets based on what he's getting in Trump Tower or the Trump White House with Trump along the front, or sitting in his hotel on Pennsylvania Avenue, then he better be right, because otherwise his credibility is going to be at stake. And that's why what he did with the Taiwanese president is so important, because it actually indicates that there's a degree of impetuosity. And in this new environment, the public doesn't like that. So you've got a problem of what I call F3. You can be first into the space, you can be fast into the space, but how flawed are you in this new environment? And let me just underline finally how profound this is. And this is unpleasant, this video, let me tell you. This shows what people are doing in this new environment and how powerful it is. The person using FaceTime live when something is happening. It's not even time shifted. This is what happened in Minnesota in July. A woman with her boyfriend who'd been stopped by a police officer, and the police officer had shot him. And the first thing she does when her boyfriend is dying alongside her is to get out her mobile phone and talk live onto FaceTime.
Stay with me. We got pulled over for a busted tail light in the back. And the police just, he's covered. They killed my boyfriend. He's licensed, he's licensed to carry. He was trying to get out his ID and his wallet out his pocket, and he let the officer know that he had a firearm and he was reaching for his wallet, and the officer just shot him in his arm. We're waiting for a back. I will, sir. No worries. I will. He just shot his arm off.
Okay, that confirms who the officer was, what he was doing, and also his reaction. And he's charged now. But for too long, the American police have got away with that. Now the American police are having to change the way they do things. There's one case in Chicago of a young 17-year-old who was killed some time ago, and then dashcam footage emerged showing what the police officers did to him and why. But their depositions of the incident which led to his death had all lied about what happened. The reason I could show you that case as well, but that led to the resignation of the chief police officer for Chicago because of the power of video. So what I hope I've done is reassured you, encouraged you, excited you, maybe depressed you, but I hope what I've given is a realistic interpretation of some very, very serious issues, but areas in which there is room for movement forward, movement which can result in solutions rather than shutdown. And just to cheer you up, I'll show you what can happen on a bad day if you are the commanding officer of Buckingham Palace in London.
We wandered up to the gates, and like everyone else, pressed our noses through the bars, and there was the guardsman marching backwards and forwards. And this guardsman seemed to be not doing exactly what he should. He was marching up and down quite normally, and then suddenly he would do what can only be described as a pirouette. He'd spun round on his walk backwards and forwards from his sentry box. And
if you're the two-star general in charge of the household division, that's a bad day in the office. It's military disruption which you could never expect, but it's indicative of the disruption you can face, and it's not a great career enhancement, however conformist you've been to get to the top. But I hope that's given you an idea of just how complex, challenging, and for me as an analyst, exciting it is, not least the number of people who now want to talk about it. And I think we're probably in takeoff mode where this is probably quite soon going to become a public issue. Jan.
Thank you, Nik, for sharing your insights. You're sharing your insights in disrupted leadership, I would say, plus some other things. Questions? Short. Short. Yeah.
Please do challenge if you've got good information.
Yes, Nik, thank you very much. First and foremost, from your pre-screening, how many in the world, the think tank that can't think, that you discovered that they are out of line? Number two, do you walk the talk yourself?
Do you have evidence that I don't? No, give him the microphone back. Do you have evidence that I don't?
Yes.
That I don't walk the...
exchange card.
What?
When we exchange card.
Well, that's not the same as walking the talk. All I did is take two of your cards, actually.
Right. No, what I'm trying to say, your card is almost blank. Okay. So the ideation is not there. So you're living at 20C, not 21C.
I don't know about other think tanks. What I would suggest to you is that last year, this year in Davos, the World Economic Forum thought that this issue of thinking the unthinkable for leadership was too hot to handle. In January, a month from now, it's going to be responsible and responsive leadership. So things have moved on.
Other questions? Yes.
First, I would like to thank you for this very nice lecture. So I have two questions. First, I think is more immediate, dealing with the media, which a background that you have anchored in for the past many years of your life. So my immediate question after your lecture is about citizenship reporting. So till now, this is a notion, a practice only in emergency largely. So my question to you is, when would you see the mainstream media proudly gather information from crowd? So it's a crowdsourcing media.
Can I answer that first of all? I don't recognize what you're talking about. The traditional news platforms are using it all the time.
Yeah, but only in a very minor way.
No, they're not. That's not true.
But no, it's only in...
That is not true. A vast amount of information now, and what we see, and I've got plenty of examples here, is now coming, and that's the point I made with Brussels Airport.
Yeah.
So I'm afraid your contention is wrong.
No, I'm talking about in the non-political arena. So in other news, so if every day I'm on Bloomberg, BBC, CNN, occasionally, etc., so what do I hear is always big enterprise, big this, big that, big all sorts, and then they will get into the limelight. So
that's not the same as the first point you made.
Yeah, that's right. So I have not qualified my sentence when I was asking the question. So I would like to know how in a timeline scale, like how soon we will see a diminishing mainstream media. Because my question eventually lead to this. This is the first question. And would you like to hear the second question first, or would you like to answer this first?
Well, how quickly are we seeing the diminution of mainstream media? Well,
that means the proportion has changed.
Nothing I'm going to say is going to surprise you. Every media organization is struggling for survival at the moment, creating new revenues, but there is still value in providing curated, filtered, value-added news. It's marginal, but when Jeff Bezos spends 1% of his income to buy the Washington Post, I think for $250 million, that's because the Washington Post, with its very limited circulation, but it's very high quality, is still valued. So there is still a value. But notwithstanding that there are those of the next generation in the room, it's about the taste, it's about the consumption, and it's about the demand that there is for it. And don't read anything into my decision to step aside from the BBC, But I think that cannot be guaranteed. Let me tell you one story, if I can do it. Are there any Scotsmen in the room? All right. Well, to give you an idea of just how complicated this area is becoming and why nothing I say will really reassure you one way or the other. There was the Scottish referendum 2 years ago, and a good friend of mine who's in NATO Strategic Communications, he comes from Scotland, and he was walking along Princes Street, which is the main avenue in Edinburgh, and he met a big Scotsman with a big beard and a T-shirt wearing a kilt. And on the T-shirt it said, "We was robbed." And Ben went up to him and said, "What do you mean we was robbed?" "Aye, we was robbed. The English, they stole this referendum from the Scots." And Ben said, "Well, how do you know that?" He said, "I know everything. I watch Russia Today every night." Now, we can laugh at that, but that's a very sinister development. It means, like Fox News in the United States, people are consuming the news which it suits them to hear, and that may not be in any way balanced or accurate, and that is a major challenge. Sorry, your second question.
Yes, the second question comes back to the 9 points you made, which I really love, admire, and hear it from your mouth. So my question to you is that how active a role you will play in this world right now and make this happen right here. Thank you.
How active a role what? Sorry, say again.
How active a role you will play in making this happen in enterprise, institutions,
okay,
and
good.
Places of governance.
Yeah, that's what I thought you meant. Well, as Jan knows, I pay tribute to the NTU for realizing the importance of this, as much based on what I think is regarded in Singapore as a very forward-leaning approach to this, which should be adapted by many other countries as well. When I started down this track over a flat white in a coffee shop, I didn't believe I'd be standing here talking about this on this kind of scale. But it's become something which is no longer 24/7, it's 25/8. There are large numbers of corporate executives and senior government executives, the kind of people like Peter Ho, and he's left the public service now, formally, although he does things with the PM's office. There are many like that, and that's why I mentioned Nick Macpherson, why I mentioned Simon Fraser from Britain, who now feel very uncomfortable about the way things have gone. And I did say a short time ago, we're almost in takeoff mode, but many of these alcoholics don't want to go public about it. Now they feel it's something which is indicative of a very serious challenge, not to them as leaders, but to leadership as a skill and a necessity. Someone's got to lead a company. Someone's got to lead a government. It can't be just left to a kind of sense of anarchy. And so who's going to be doing it in future? And they want to share it now because, as I was talking to Eddie about just before this, Eddie Chu down at the front, it's the kind of thing that the next generation, the undergraduates, the mid-career students, need to get into their brain, that the conformity which they think they've got to adopt should no longer be the way in which they pursue their careers. Now, I'm not being moralistic about this. I'm saying that I think it's about to become a much more public issue, a bit like climate change. But I don't want to be too grand about this. It may not happen, but I can tell you it's moved much faster than I ever expected in the last 3 or 4 months. There are people like Paul Polman of Unilever, who has survived for 7 years as chief executive, upholding some of these values, particularly not having quarterly reporting. People like Joe Kaiser of Siemens, the president and global chief executive, who was at the Singapore summit talking about this kind of thing as well. But they're not sure yet whether there's a sufficient momentum, a self-fulfilling momentum, which can make this a success and something which is not going to marginalize very talented people and have them kicked out by a board. It's a very delicate balance at the moment, and I can't therefore tell you. But I believe that next year there could be some significant developments.
Yes, you gave some suggestions, as to how, like these, like the current slide now as to how, you know, we could improve. I just wonder, you know, whether you realize that actually you are advocating us to go back to basics because you are using words such as purpose. What is our purpose? Right? You're using words such as values. You know, you're using words such as, I think that we need, leaders need courage. And you say things like, I think our leaders need humility. Now, these are words that are very, very basic, you know, it's rather old-fashioned. And I think it's good. Maybe we have swung to the extremes, and now we realize that we got to get back to the basics. You also use words like, let's call the wacky wise, you know, that's nice. Let's call the mavericks visionaries. Nice, rephrase, recast, reframe. Let's practice some moderation. Okay, good. I hope that you, in the future, will elaborate more on this, because I think that the world thirsts for such words, which has long been forgotten since, say, 1989, which you mentioned in your talk, since the last 25 years, since the end of history, because in the last 25 years, it's just been rampant, unbridled capitalism. You know, so,
okay.
Just a comment. Thank you.
You say I've said all that. You're correct, technically, it came out of my mouth. But I want to make it absolutely clear, those words have come from the leaders themselves in the one-to-one interviews. That is what they say has to be the way forward. But showing humility, if you're threatening to be having your legs cut off, is not easy. And I'm using an extreme in order to make a point. But do not say that I'm giving a value judgment or giving you my opinion. Everything I've been telling you is not about Gowing thinks this or Gowing is recommending that. This is based on these private, one-to-one confidential interviews. I can't share with you 2,500 pages of transcript, but you have to believe me. And that's why the direction of travel is potentially so critical. It's not about saving capitalism. It's about saving economic activity.
Thank you for the presentation. Have you done the same to vice-chancellors? It would be extremely desirable. We have a ridiculous situation in universities. I have a little daughter at home who plays with 3 electronic systems simultaneously, and we're hard pushed to deliver proper digital information in universities. It takes up to 3 years to organize a new course. This is simply ridiculous, and we can't go on doing it. We have to radically change the universities, the education system, as well as business and government. We have to do the try.
Thank you, Roland. I haven't yet got round to vice-chancellors. Getting them together and agreeing together is going to be quite difficult, but I have been to the University of Sydney, and I know the difficulties of setting up my laptop there. I'm also struck by the proliferation, the prolific number of Chinese students there, and the way the academia is changing inside inside your country, and I see that elsewhere. But let me tell you, my godfather was Keith Hancock, who was a founding father of the ANU. But coming to Sydney and giving this presentation a couple of times, I've wondered if there's been a bit of a disconnect between what I'm saying and what the attitude of those sitting in front of me is. But if you'd like me to meet the Vice-Chancellor, I'm more than happy to do so. But I fear that most Vice-Chancellors feel they know the way they want to run a university. Hang on, you better put this through the microphone.
Our Vice-Chancellor would undoubtedly be on your side.
In that case, I'd be delighted to come for dinner.
The problem is that not very far down, plenty are not, because they want to behave and reason exactly in the form.
All right, challenge for you, Roland. I'm going to be in Australia in May, and I'll be coming through Sydney. Why don't you start working on a closed session with those below the Vice-Chancellor to see what their reaction is?
And I'll get you to the Vice-Chancellor.
Give me your card.
Pleasure.
Before we part. No, but this is how the challenges can actually be addressed. But I have a feeling there will be a lot of them who won't be nodding their heads. I should perhaps ask, if I may, Jan, does anyone violently disagree or even marginally disagree with any of the findings? Because that is really very helpful for me. If there's people sitting there thinking, this is all rubbish, why has he come here to Singapore to espouse that kind of stuff, all this kind of research? Because it's really important for me to know. And I'm not trying to threaten you by saying almost no one ever pushes back. In fact, I've seen a lot of people nodding their heads today. So thank you for bringing a very kind audience, Jan.
Very good. Well, are you violently disagreeing, Sheila?
No, it's...
What's it?
I've been Vice Chancellor and I have run a big organization.
Would you recommend that I bring a lot of Vice Chancellors together to discuss this?
Let me. So I think they will be yes or no, agreeing with most of the points, because we all are exposed to it. My question is, did you ask them the question, what do you do against this? Because this is the problem. You know, when you look at the leadership we have now, we all know, and I could survive because I had my spies in the system. And I was listening to the spies, because then you know what's going on. Don't listen to the line telling you what your institution is. Dead wrong. And many of the leaders have actually implemented a system which at the end of the day brings that as a result. If they
this is a result.
That's the result, yeah. If they complain that this is happening in their system, did you ask them the question, what did you do against it?
That's a very good question. Let me just go back on some of the methodology. First of all, getting emails or personal contacts or using intermediaries to set up the interview with very busy people was very, very tough. And when we finally got in the door, you could feel that the weight of emails, WhatsApp and everything else was on their minds. After about 15 or 20 minutes, they relaxed. No one was interrupting them. And meetings which often were scheduled for only half an hour or 45 minutes lasted for 2 hours because they felt that this was a form of unburdening. And it's important that you know that we didn't say, do you agree that? We asked, what's your view on? And that's important because we were not leading them into giving any kind of prescriptive answer. And that's why this evidence is so powerful. What you say is an important question, and I want you to be clear the limits of our research so far. It's taken us a long time to get this far, to get doors open, to get all the research aggregated in a way which was acceptable and credible, and also would stand the test of the peer review and also others. And that's why it's endured, because it is reflecting very much what those at the top are feeling. So what we're now doing is going back and asking exactly these questions, because it was difficult enough in an hour, 45 minutes or 2 hours to get them to concede the scale of the problem. Now, talking about solutions is something different, and I think we will benefit because some of them have started implementing something. But we've now got to work out whether it's worked. But going back to the Council on Foreign Relations and Mika Zenko, saying very clearly the people at the top are not good at analyzing their own problems because they can't mark their own homework, you will recognize that. That's a central kind of issue. So we've got to work through the methodology of getting through the door. And so far it's working. But I think that's partly in response to the lady's question over there. That's because there's a shift going on in terms of attitude to leadership and a realization of the new vulnerabilities, hastened by Brexit, hastened by Trump, and hastened by other things that are now happening in the world. So I'm reporting to you sampling which was done 18 months to 6 months ago, and trying to get that out in a contemporaneous way in a very fast-moving dynamic is a tough skill. And one of the ways we're hoping to do it now is rather than going through a publication like we've produced, which is 50 pages long, with a mountain of footnotes, but nothing declared in terms of identity, is maybe do it in some kind of wiki process so people can contribute online. Because what we're doing is we're trying to create a community and a process here. And we think, rather like alcoholics, that many of them will be happy to feel that they are not alone, and therefore they'll start exchanging views. That has begun, and we're trying to track it. But your question is absolutely spot on. I can't give you a satisfactory answer apart from saying that we're working on it. It's not easy, though.
Thank you for answering the question on method. I wonder if your respondent said anything about values. What values should we be teaching the young? Or if you do follow up, I think a question of values would be a really interesting question to ask your respondents.
It's a really good question, Peter. The answer is implicitly yes, but not explicitly in the time available. I would suggest to you that this is something which has emerged in the last 3 to 4 months more explicitly in discussions. A year ago, if Jan had invited me to do this a year ago, I would not be nothing like as optimistic, and some of that stuff wouldn't be up there because it wasn't apparent. And it's only in the last 2 or 3 months that much of this has started being actively debated more publicly, even within closed-door brainstormings. So that's what I think Brexit has really hastened, because there has been, excuse my French, the oh shit moment, which is, oh, we're not in touch with the people we're serving, either as politicians or corporates, and that they are beginning to wake up. And a lot of them are beginning to talk to us digitally at the moment through their offices, wanting to talk about it in a way which would not have happened. I know several of the people who are now actively talking about this were reluctant to even consider this as an issue 9 to 12 months ago. So it's moving very fast, based on that sense of fragility. And also, and this may not chime very easily with some of you, some of them feel a degree of responsibility. One very senior chief executive said, look, I get paid a lot of money at the moment. I don't care if I get sacked. But I feel now that this is a very serious issue. It's brackets, I've made my money, but I want to linger, and I want to now take a risk in putting this center stage, front of stage, because of this existential threat that there is. Because if we don't address it, it'll get even worse. And with AI coming down the track, with the Internet of Things coming down the track, 1,000 jobs becoming 2 jobs very quickly, this has massive challenges as well for the political class. It's not about leaving the European Union. It's about how people in Britain will actually have jobs in future, how people elsewhere in this part of the world as well. Up in China, if Foxconn is sacking 60,000 people producing iPhones and iPads because they're being replaced by robots, that's a massive change, and it ain't going to happen in 20 years. It's happening in 20 months. Look what's happening in the port at the moment. You don't have 1,000 people working there. It can all be operated by 6 people. And the shipping business doesn't know what's going to happen in the future, because the future is about 3D printing. It's about robots. It may be cheaper, as a senior shipping figure said to me only a few weeks ago. He said, it may be cheaper now for people to produce equipment in Germany, not in Taiwan or China, because they don't then have the shipping costs and the delay. And also stuff can be printed 3D at no cost virtually in situ, where it's going to be sold or used rather than being shipped as a finished goods halfway around the world. This is going to have a massive effect on all those ships sitting out in the harbour here. So this is happening very quickly.
Okay. One last question, and then we go to tea. To have tea. The gentleman over there.
Hi. Just now you mentioned that Jeff Bezos bought over Washington Post because he's publishing very quality articles.
Because what? Because what?
He's publishing very quality articles, right? Jeff Bezos. Buying over the Washington Post.
That's not quite what I said. He bought it, but the Washington Post is still producing high-quality journalism based on Jeff Bezos' $250 million, which is 1% of his wealth, because he's supporting it, not because it's supported by the cover price and reduced advertising.
But the irony is that after Jeff Bezos bought it, the people are now thinking that Washington Post actually serves Jeff Bezos' interests and thus it becomes not credible. And is ironically a very counterproductive process. So what's your take on that?
Who knows? When Donald Trump invited 4 leading members of the traditional media in to see him in Trump Tower, including Wolf Blitzer of CNN, they left with a leak to the New York Post, which I'm reliably told was done by Mr. Trump himself, and with the journalist leaving, describing that talking to Mr. Trump about the free press was like facing an F*****CKING firing squad, which raises enormous and troubling questions about the way the media will survive. The New York Times, when they had their interview with Donald Trump, several of the senior editorial figures went in, 2 weeks ago, and Trump insisted that it would be off the record, and they said, in that case, we're not doing it, and they did it on the record. And read the transcript, it's a very different atmosphere because it was on the record.
But does this mean that actually Jeff Bezos shouldn't have bought the Washington Post in the first place?
I can't. It's his money. I'm not making that judgment at all. Look, the Washington Post survives. Is it still 40 cents an edition? I mean, it hardly pays for the newsprint. And the advertising is dramatically down because the nature of, I mean, if you know in the Washington Post, it's a bit like in the Straits Times, which is a bit thinner these days. They're not advertising what you can buy in shops, even though you've got the big shopping mall being, I mean, this is a country of shopping malls. And the new one being built out at Changi Airport, you wonder what is different and how much is going to be sold and what kind of things are going to be sold. But the Washington Post, if it didn't have Jeff Bezos' money, would be really suffering because the Sears and all those big multi-store companies were not advertising because everything's gone online. And so you don't need newsprint. And people don't consume news by waiting for it to flop onto their front door at 6 o'clock in the morning.
Okay.
Have I cheered everyone up, Jan?
Sorry?
Have I cheered everyone up?
Stirred everybody, maybe. Stirred everybody up. Anyway, thank you very much. Please thank...